afternoon and evening all, and welcome. Bonjour et bienvenue à tous. We're just letting people into the event, so while we're doing so, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, affiliation, and where you're calling in from today. N'hésitez pas à vous introduire en utilisant le chat avec votre nom, organisation et base de travail. We do have interpretation into French for our event today, so I'm going to hand over to our interpreter to explain how this will work. On aura la traduction en français. Je vais donner la parole aux traductrices pour vous expliquer le processus.
Good morning, good afternoon. So if you'd like to use interpretation, English interpretation, you can click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and choose the language you'd like to listen to. Donc, cette table ronde sera interprétée en français. Si vous souhaitez bénéficier de l'interprétation simultanée, il vous suffit de cliquer sur l'icône de globe terrestre au bas de votre écran et de choisir la langue que vous souhaitez écouter.
Thank you very much to Rose and Iris for making this event accessible to our Francophone colleagues. Next, we have a few housekeeping and accessibility issues to cover. I will hand over to Malio for this.
Hello, everyone. So glad that everyone is here. My name is Malio Kodis. I work with the Women's Environment and Development Organization, and I'm the accessibility coordinator for this call. That means that you can reach out to me if you have any issues with your accessibility or your audio or anything like that. You can either private message me in the Zoom chat, or you can email me. My email is here on the screen. Feel free to write it down, though the Zoom chat should work just fine. As a reminder, please mute your microphone when you're not speaking. Please turn off your camera if it affects your connection, or because we're recording this call, if you don't want to be recorded, please leave your camera off. Remove all distractions and be present for this great discussion. Use the chat box for communication and make yourself comfortable. Thank you and looking forward.
Thank you, Malio, for helping everything to run smoothly for the event today. My name is Angie Daze, and I'm a Senior Policy Advisor and Gender Equality Lead for the Resilience team at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, or IISD. I use she, her pronouns. I'll be your moderator today. This dialogue is part of the overall Race to Zero dialogues, which has included a set of dialogues that are specifically focused on resilience. Today, our event is the third in a series of dialogues on gender responsive and socially equitable resilience in climate policy and action. The first two dialogues focused on the Asia Pacific region and on Latin America and the Caribbean. It's been IISD's pleasure to organize this series of dialogues with the Women and Gender constituency, and we're really grateful to the team at WeDo and to the whole constituency for the collaboration on this. We've planned an interactive session for you today, and you'll have the opportunity to contribute both during breakout group discussions and through some polls and other participation tools. Next slide, please. To get us started, I just wanted to briefly introduce the two entities who have come together to organize this series of dialogues. The Women and Gender constituency is one of the observer constituencies under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The constituency was founded in 2009 and was granted full observer constituency status in 2011. In 2015, the constituency launched the Gender Just Climate Solutions Awards program in an effort to promote climate action that's both just and equitable. Today, in 2020, the constituency has 32 member organizations who are all officially credited as observers to the UNFCCC, as well as an advocacy network of over 500 groups and individuals. You can find more information on the Women and Gender constituency at the website that you see here. IISD is a member of the Women and Gender constituency, but we are collaborating to organize these dialogues in our capacity as the Secretariat of the National Adaptation Plan Global Network. Gender is a theme of focus for the NAP Global Network, and we've worked with a number of countries to provide technical support on integrating gender in their national adaptation plan processes, as well as facilitating peer-to-peer learning and developing knowledge products on integrating gender in NAP processes. It's important to note that most of our knowledge products are available in French, and you can find more information and these resources at the websites shown on the slide. Across both IISD's work and the work of the Women and Gender constituency is an intersectional approach, considering the ways in which people's various identities and lived experiences influence their resilience to the impacts of climate change. So what we're talking about today is an approach to resilience that is both gender responsive and socially equitable in an effort to ensure that no one is left behind. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Nigel Topping, a high-level climate champion for the United Kingdom, who will provide us with some opening remarks. Before being named the climate champion for this year, Nigel was the CEO of We Mean Business, a coalition that played a key role in bringing the voice of business forward in support of the Paris Agreement, and which is continuing to drive ambition and action to accelerate the transition to a zero carbon economy. We're really pleased to have him here today. And over to you, Nigel.
Great, thank you, Angie. Lovely to be with you all. I thought I'd just start by reminder for those who are not UNFCCC geeks of what a high-level climate action champion is supposed to do. So for those of you who don't know, the role was created in Paris as part of the recognition by the parties to the UN Convention that national governments can't solve the climate crisis on their own, and they really need the mobilization of the whole of society. So the idea of the champions and the mandate's quite loosely defined, but it's very clear. It's to work with private sector, local government, and civil society to accelerate, to raise ambition and accelerate action on climate change, and in so doing so support the parties in raising their ambition and accelerating their action. We often talk about the ambition loop. And so I work closely with my colleague Gonzalo Munoz, who's the high-level champion for COP25. It's a COP. Used to say 2 years, but because it's 3 years now because of the delay of COP26. So two COP. We're very, we launched the Race to Zero, and then we have the Race to Zero dialogues. It's going very well. There's lots of momentum building, but it's really focused on mitigation, as the title suggests, right? It's getting emissions down to zero. And we're very aware of the trap of following the easily measurable. It's similar to the trap that sometimes we fall into when focusing purely on GDP rather than some of the qualitative measures of development. Really inspired actually by the work of Amartya Sen and the International Panel on Social Progress, who did a very extensive report and a nice little book called the Manifesto on Social Progress, in which they describe the need for us to solve for sustainability, inequality, and freedom at the same time, and try and imagine a world in which we only solve for 2 of those 3. And it's not a world that you'd want to live in. It can't really hold together. So we're particularly conscious of the asymmetries in the climate world. Of course, the asymmetries around climate justice, which is both north-south, has a strong gender element, a strong indigenous element. I mean, there's lots of justice asymmetries. Very conscious of the structural bias towards action on mitigation rather than adaptation and resilience, which of course we've contributed to by launching Race to Zero first. So we're trying to address that. But of course, given my background, I am not an expert on adaptation and resilience, global south, or gender issues. So I'm really in listening and learning mode, and these dialogues have been tremendously helpful. I had another one this morning with colleagues from around the world, looking at particularly at how do we land the local, the need for local action in the global context. So I say I'm in learning mode, but soon we're going to be in action mode. So Gonzalo and I, with our team, and with all of your help and input, are looking to launch, if you like, a sister campaign to the Race to Zero, which we'll probably call the Race for Resilience, for obvious reasons. Actually, maybe not such obvious reasons. I mean, the race because the race idea seems to have got momentum, and we think that's good because this really is urgent. We think it's really important to try, and our job is nothing to do with the negotiations. The negotiations are really important and have their own challenges and their own momentum, but we think that quite often this work in the, let me call it the resilience agenda, gets sucked back into the complexities and the politics of negotiations, which are different from the complexities and politics of making change on the ground in communities. So for example, it's why you won't normally hear me use the phrase adaptation and resilience, because I don't think that's a normal English phrase. And it's immediately confusing if you're not familiar with the negotiations. It's an important phrase because it has a specific meaning in the context of negotiations, but an ordinary member of a community, an ordinary business leader, an ordinary city leader, it's a strange juxtaposition of similar terms. So we're going to focus our campaign on the idea of resilience and really put human resilience and addressing the development needs of the most vulnerable at the heart of that campaign. And we also think it's really important to avoid the trap, which it's easy to fall into, especially when you focus on the negotiated aspect of the 100 billion, which is again is really important, and it's a commitment and it needs to be honoured. But quite often that narrative of adaptation and resilience being about the 100 billion ends up being being a narrative of victims and money only, and it loses the complexity of just how amazingly resilient communities are. I mean, just hearing some of the stories this morning of, for example, in Bangladesh, of a 16-year-old girl who'd learned to build rafts and had rescued 45 people in one of the recent floods. You know, I just want to make sure that our narrative isn't one of victims and handouts, but one of resilient communities needing hands up, and us coming together. So I've also been made very aware of the particularly egregious gender asymmetry in the impact of climate disasters on women as opposed to men, with some of the shocking statistics that you're all very familiar with. So I'm really keen to listen to the rest. And the challenge that I'm grappling with is, how do you run a global campaign which is driving scale whilst recognizing the unique contexts at the local level, and hence the importance of listening to the voices of youth, of women, of Indigenous in particular, because the context is shaped by their lived experience. And so I'm grappling with that dilemma of how to get to scale whilst recognizing the unique lived experience at the local level where implementation must take place. And so, Angie and everybody, thank you for organising this, and I look forward to learning a lot in the rest of the hour. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nigel, and thanks for highlighting. I mean, I think you've brought up many of the challenges that we're grappling with in terms of, you know, dealing with gender and social inequalities. We're really looking at deep systemic issues. And I think that's where a global campaign can really come in handy, by shining a light on these sort of entrenched discriminatory systems that impede resilience for some members of societies. And I think you've highlighted the sort of challenge of sort of keeping adaptation and resilience at the forefront when it is this very messy, tricky, complex, long-term thing that's difficult to measure. And I can say we are really excited about the launch of the Race for Resilience. We're really happy to see that moving forward. And I think the challenge of, you know, trying to have this global scale when we know what's needed is action at the local level. And you mentioned about ensuring voices are at the table. And I think that's something that, you know, most of us who work on these issues really agree with, is that, you know, participation is the foundation for moving these kinds of changes forward. So thank you so much for highlighting all those really important issues, and thank you for being here. I know it's a very busy couple of weeks for you, so we're really happy that you could join us. Great. So next, we wanted to hear from you. We are going to use the Mentimeter tool to engage you in a bit of discussion. We have 2 questions that we'd like you to answer. So if you can use your phone or on your laptop, go to www.menti.com and you'll see a code to enter. My colleague Cesar is going to bring that up so that you can see the code. So you enter the code 5561540, and you'll have a question: what is a key lesson from the pandemic towards resilience and gender responsive climate action? And you can input, I think, up to 3 different times. And once people start sending in their responses, we'll start to see some ideas coming forward. And I think that the direct link to will also be entered into the chat if that's an easier way to get there. So equity and gender equality right out of the gate. Empathy, such an important consideration when we're looking at some of these issues. Rapid change, collaboration, listen to experts. That's a very important one for both the pandemic and climate change. Intersectionality, fighting inequality, transformative change. Inclusivity. These are all issues that we really wanted to bring forward through the discussions that we're going to have over the next couple of hours. Appreciation of work, care, prepare. I'm loving seeing things like love and care coming out here. I think that has been really an important message of this experience that we're going through right now with the pandemic. Beautiful. Transformative change. I think that's the core of what we're really looking for if we're really going to build resilience in a gender responsive and socially equitable way. So maybe we can move on now to the next question, which is, in what ways can principles of resilience support equity and diversity in climate action? So how can looking at this with a resilience lens really ensure that we're moving climate action forward in a way that does support equity and diversity? Community, inclusivity, participation, shared outcomes, partnerships, bottom-up action. So we're really seeing these issues that Nigel was bringing out around participation, about sort of the need for action to be at the local level, contextualizing the action, talking about humans and different people, that different people matter, taking a human rights approach and a whole of society approach. Great, well, you can keep inputting, but I think we're going to move on. So thank you so much for those thoughts, and you'll have a couple of other opportunities to provide inputs as we move forward. So next, we're going to move into our panel discussion. We've brought together a really talented and interesting panel to discuss some of these issues around gender responsive and socially inclusive resilience today. I'll just go through the introductions. Tracy Kajumba is a principal researcher and team leader for strengthening partnerships within the International Institute for Environment and Development, IIED's climate change group. Tracy has over 17 years of development research, policy influencing, gender equality, climate change adaptation, and adaptation monitoring and evaluation learning experience. Elizabeth Gulugulu is an environmentalist who is representing the Africa Youth Climate Hub. Elizabeth is highly experienced in youth mobilization and activism for climate smart and sustainable agricultural solutions. She has spoken on these issues at different meeting fora, including the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change meetings, and was a green ticket winner to the Climate Action Summit in New York in 2019. John Baki works with Women Environmental Program Nigeria as a Deputy Executive Director. John is an environmentalist and gender expert with over 8 years of experience at national and international levels, and is a committed development practitioner with a passion for gender and climate change. Dominica Chingarande is a visiting research associate at the University of Zimbabwe with vast experience as a gender specialist, including gender and social exclusion analysis and gender audits across sectors, including agriculture and rural development, land tenure, health, climate change, among others. Dominica has worked as a gender specialist in many African countries. Gina Zervogel is an associate professor in the Department of Environmental and Geographical Science at the University of Cape Town. Gina's research focuses on climate change adaptation and development across scales from the household to the municipal level. Gina is a lead author on the IPCC's 6th assessment report and has authored numerous papers, books, chapters, and popular articles. And last but not least, Olga Dianeva is one of the founders and the head of the women's organization ALGA, which is one of the leaders of the Action Coalition on Feminist Action for Climate Justice. Through ALGA, Olga works for women's rights and gender equality across a range of areas, including climate change and disaster risk reduction. Women's movement building is a key strategy used by the organization. So thanks to our panelists for being here. And it will be great if you haven't already, if you can turn on your cameras. And just a reminder for the sake of our translators to please speak slowly and take your time as we're going through this conversation. So to start, I'd like to hear from you, Tracy. What do we mean by resilience and why is it critical to the so-called race to zero?
Thank you, Angie. I'd like to say that resilience is multidimensional, and building resilience will involve empowering people, communities, institutions, countries to be able to anticipate, adapt, or transform shocks and stresses and impacts on people, economies, and ecosystem. We talk about resilience most of the time as an outcome, but it's important to note that it's a process. The quality of the process is as important as the outcome. The resilience of who and what risks and shocks becomes important. And it is at the who where inequality and exclusion is really perpetrated, as well as gender inequality. So resilience approaches should really respond to complex gender equality dynamics, increase social inclusion at multiple levels. And also it's about changing how we work. Most times we think, oh, I'm designing a resilience program. Most programs across sectors have the capacity to build resilience, but how we deliver matters, not what we deliver. That becomes important. And the linkage with Race to Zero. Race to Zero campaign is looking at climate leadership through building capabilities. And that's one of the key aspects of resilience. We don't just look at the programs, but building capabilities of people, institutions across scale. The whole of society approach becomes important. The global campaign is talking about business, cities, investors. It's important to note that no single institution has the capacity to build resilience of anybody or any program forever. It's a partnership, it's a combination of institutions across government, across society. And the campaign is also focusing on recovery from risks and shocks and future threats. But how does that happen? Climate risk management becomes important, even for businesses, even for local communities. Decisions need to be informed by weather and climate information. So how do people access information? How do we integrate that into investment decisions? How are governance decisions made with information on what is anticipated in the future for us to be able to anticipate that and build resilience programs informed by the science that is available. Unless that happens, then the sustainable and inclusive growth that the campaign is focusing on might not happen. And also for sustainability and inclusive growth, I think investing in long-term processes becomes important, whether financially, whether investing in people, investing in processes becomes important, because the short-term programming, the siloed programming is not going to be helpful for us to achieve resilience. Thank you, Angie.
Thanks, Tracy. I think you've really highlighted a lot of the complexities that we're dealing with here. Next, I'd like to hear from Elizabeth. What do you think of when we talk about resilience, and why do you think it's critical to the race to zero? Elizabeth, I'm not hearing you. Okay, why don't we go to Olga, and hopefully we can work out Elizabeth's sound issues. Olga, what do we mean by resilience and why is it critical to the race to zero? Olga?
So sorry. I hope my mic. Hello to everyone. Thank you, Angie. I think that resilience, especially during this pandemic related to COVID-19 and exacerbates the crisis that we already having with climate change. And so resilience to me means the ability of the community to respond to these shocks that we can counter like in several aspects. We can see that during the pandemic, we met the different consequences of this. Speaking from the gender point of view, we that women were the first who lose their jobs, and we observed increase of domestic care work for women, and at the same time it was a sharp increase in gender-based violence, and so worsening of the well-being of the families, and at the same time resilience. We in this time we understood that we really have a great gap in the understanding of resilience. So I think that it is like several capacities should be in focus, like anticipatory capacity. So the capacity, the ability of human systems to anticipate and reduce the impact of shocks through preparedness and planning. Then we can also say about absorptive capacity, the ability of human systems to absorb and cope with the impacts of shocks and the stresses. Another capacity is adaptive capacity, the ability of human systems to change in response to multiple long-term and future and current risk, and to learn and adjust after these shocks materializes. And the most important is transformative capacity, that is the ability to take deliberate steps to change systems that create risks, vulnerability, and inequality. And I think that today's conversation and the webinar is very up to date because it's speaking about gender inequalities that we observed during these 8 months of the pandemic. So really make us to think more focused on the need to build capacities, not only communities, but women. So to build capacities of our politicians. And so it is like a very deep issue. And so I would like that I hope that today we shall discuss it in depth and from different aspects. Thank you, Angie.
Thanks so much, Olga. And thanks for really emphasizing that resilience is about a set of capacities and that these capacities are interconnected. And I think that's a really important point to bring out to start us off in this discussion. I'm going to try again for Elizabeth. Elizabeth, have you been able to work out your sound issues? And if so, would you like to tell us what resilience means to you and why it's important to the race to zero? Okay, in that case, we'll—
Hi, Angie, it's Malio. I've reached out to Elizabeth, but haven't heard back from her. So
okay, I think she's having connection issues. Okay, thanks so much, Malio. Then let's hear from Dominica. can you tell us what you think we mean when we talk about resilience and why you think it's important to the race to zero?
Thank you very much. For me, resilience is about protection of development gains in the face of recurrent shocks and stresses. So when we're looking at resilience, we're looking at it at different levels. We are not just looking at resilience from the perspective of the ecosystem, but we're also looking at resilience from the perspective of individuals, from the perspectives of households, communities, and also systems. So it's important to appreciate that whenever we are discussing issues of resilience, it's a complex issue that relates to systems, that also relates to individuals as they relate to each other, and also as they relate to the ecosystem. So the most important thing is the issue to do with evidence. What evidence do we have in relation to gender issues, for example, when we're talking about resilience? I think evidence is very important. We gather this evidence through gender analysis. Once we appreciate the way society is organized in terms of gender relations, in terms of the structure, we'll be able also to address issues to do with resilience at individual and also at community level. That information also helps us to appreciate differential access to resources by men and women at community level, including access to information and other services that are important for building the resilience capacity of the individuals at household level. So once we have all that information, it helps us to come up with localized solutions to some of the challenges that men and women are experiencing. I think from the opening remarks, it was very clear that these issues can be global, but the solutions should be localized. So from that perspective, we then have to appreciate through evidence how the society is organized, how communities are organized, and also custom design the interventions. So resilience should not be imposed on communities. Resilience should be part of a community, which is solutions that are driven from the community. So I have an appreciation that apart from the lessons that we are drawing from COVID-19, we need to go beyond infrastructure to investing in social relations, to investing in social capital. What informal social safety nets are in place to support resilience? What formal social support networks are in place to support resilience of individuals and communities? So to me, those are some of the critical issues. Social capital, yes, informal and both informal and formal, but also look at investments in infrastructure, investments in governance issues, because they're also very critical when we're talking about resilience, particularly in the context of COVID-19 and other pandemics that we are currently experiencing. So the importance of resilience cannot be overlooked when we're talking about the race to zero. We cannot talk about issues of sustainable development, issues of race to zero without talking about resilience. Consultations are very critical. Stakeholder involvement is very critical. Issues of investment in infrastructure is very critical. Investments in social capital and social safety or social protection broadly is also very critical when we're talking about the race to zero and also when we're talking about resilience. So basically, in a nutshell, that's why I think is critical for the race to zero and also for resilience.
Thank you so much. And I think what you've talked about is sort of some of the bigger picture issues around this really being about different systems, but then also the practicalities that we need evidence. We need to consider issues like the access to information. We need to invest in social protection systems. And certainly the pandemic has highlighted the importance of those systems. Thank you. Thank you so much. So next, I'd like to hear from John on the same question. What do you mean by resilience and why is it important in this race to zero?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Angie, for that question. Many speakers have spoken about resilience, what they already have spoken about. Let's take another dimension. When we talk about resilience, literally, we are talking about the ability to recover, the ability to bounce back after a shock, and relating it to the climate change crisis. It is the ability of individuals or communities or a nation to recover after it has been hit by the climate crisis. Let me give you an example. In Nigeria, for example, many women are farmers. That's their major livelihood. So if climate change has affected, has brought flood that has affected their farming, how will they be assisted to bounce back, to still get their livelihoods, to earn income that they will still take care of themselves and their families? How will they, for example, pay the school fees of their children? Can they use clean energy sources even as their livelihood has been affected? So these are all issues of resilience. After the impact, how will you now come back on your feet? How will you regain yourself? How will you see earn your income even after your livelihood has been affected by climate change? And this resilience vary from individual to individual or from nation to nation because of different factors. When we talk about resilience, we are underlining the fact that that individual or a nation has is vulnerable, has low adaptive capacity. And that is what has made such an individual or a nation vulnerable. To such individual or to a nation, there is need for its resilience to be built so that its coping ability will be enhanced, such that even after the impact of climate change, they can have a way of getting back their lives together. So the example I painted earlier of a farmer whose farmland has been destroyed by flood and needs to be supported to come back, how will you now support such a person in terms of livelihood? Or how will you now support such a person to also contribute to mitigating climate change, for example, by using clean energy sources? That person needs high resilience to be built to be able to contribute or to come back to her feet. And then talking about how resilience contributes to the achievement of the Race to Zero, which is a campaign that is aiming to achieve zero net carbon emission by 2050. Linkage between resilience and achieving that, because to me, without building resilience of nations or individuals, it is not possible to achieve net zero carbon emission by 2050. And I give you example, if nations are not assisted to adapt the use of cleaner energy sources to build their resilience or to help them to adapt to climate change in that way, by 2050, carbon emissions will still persist. So until nations or individuals are assisted to also contribute to mitigating climate change or to addressing the sources of emission, that is when be able to achieve the net zero carbon emission by 2050 that the Race to Zero campaign aims to achieve. So in summary, achieving net zero carbon emission by 2050 has a precondition to be met. And that precondition is that of building resilience of vulnerable populations, such as people with disabilities, women, community women groups, poor nations, and the rest. That is the precondition that has to be met before meeting the target or the goal of the Race to Zero campaign. So in other words, resilience is at the heart of achieving the goal of the Race to Zero campaign.
Thanks, John. I appreciate you putting a human face on this by sharing, an example of a woman farmer who's dealing with the impacts of climate change on her livelihoods. And also I like this idea of, resilience is a precondition for the Race to Zero goal to be met. So thanks for those thoughts. I'm now going to ask Gina to share your perspectives on resilience and why it's important to the Race to Zero.
Thank you, and hello, everybody. I think a lot's been said, so I just want to pick up on some points that I think are interesting. So I really liked Dominica's point about thinking about sort of environmental issues when you think about resilience and individual social issues. And for me, as somebody who's working in a city, I live in Cape Town and I work here, is, well, how do you balance these? And how do we start thinking about trade-offs? Because for me, we need to be thinking about both the environmental issues and the social and the economic. And so understanding what resilience means from different perspectives is often quite hard. And so this comes to a lot of the points that people were saying around principles of resilience, of inclusion and partnerships. But I also think we need to remember how challenging those sometimes are. So who are the stakeholders who are lobbying for the environment, who really understand the environmental needs in a city? Who are the individuals who can really give the local perspective? They're people living in local areas. And do the groups, these different groups, have a chance to come together? Often they don't. So how do we create these opportunities where we can listen to these diverse voices and create opportunities for building resilience? And the other part of that is across scale. So again, working in a city, I often see city level actors thinking about what resilience means at a city scale. And they might be thinking about transport systems, but are they thinking about the woman who needs to catch the bus in the morning, who needs to walk to the bus, and what her reality is? In Cape Town, a lovely example of individual versus kind of citywide resilience was around the drought and people sinking boreholes. Oh, I'm resilient, I've got the finances to sink a borehole for myself. But then if everybody's doing that, the water table's dropping and I'm actually decreasing the resilience of the city. So for me, looking at kind of going forward with these emerging shocks and stresses and the intensity of these, we really need to think carefully about what resilience means and what are the trade-offs. And I think often these trade-offs are not made explicit enough. So one group says this is what resilience means to them without saying, by following this pathway, I'm actually decreasing the resilience of another group. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Gina. And I think those interconnected issues of interconnectedness are essential here. And I like that you also brought out the importance of dialogue between different groups, different stakeholders, to try and negotiate some of the trade-offs and sort of balancing different needs. I think that's really essential as well. I think we've managed to get Elizabeth back. So I'm going to ask Elizabeth to give her thoughts on resilience and why it's important to the Race to Zero. I think we won't be able to see her, unfortunately, but hopefully we can hear her.
Yeah, I'm also hoping that you can hear me too. If you can confirm.
Yes, all good. Oh, I spoke too soon. Sorry, Elizabeth, we're not hearing you. This is very sad because I really wanted to hear your perspectives. So I think we'll go move on, and hopefully if we can bring you in later, I'll get Malio to send me a message when when we've hopefully managed to get a better connection for you. I'm really sorry about this. And yeah, we were really looking forward to hearing from you. Okay, so my next question is around lessons from the pandemic. So what are we learning from the pandemic about the importance of social protection and human rights to build resilient economies, ecosystems, and societies? Tracy, what are your thoughts on lessons from the pandemic for resilience?
Thanks, Angie. I think from the pandemic, we have learned that we can change more quickly than we thought. We've been talking about climate and campaigns are going on, and we feel like we can't do much, things can't change. But when the pandemic came, everything stopped. We saw ecosystem health getting better. I was seeing pictures of very nice forests coming up where they were not existing. So we were able to cope with that. So the whole discussion on building back better, green recovery, net zero transition is possible if we focus our energies like we've been able to do during this pandemic. For me, that's a very important lesson. But we also learned that local institutions are very important. It's all really going back to resilience, which is really multidimensional, cutting across everybody, every institution. Governments were not able to cope with this pandemic, but we saw local institutions, local communities, social movements coming up with solutions for their communities. At IID, our partners in the Global South were trying to track how they are managing, how their constituencies are managing. But we saw very powerful stories of women groups coming up to make soap, because they're saying, wash your hands, you don't have money to buy the soap. So there were those willing to teach others to make soap so that they access that service that is not available. They were working with their local leaders to track those that might enter the communities. So it sort of became part of the solution, part of the governance system. And that's why it becomes very important to build the capabilities of local institutions as we talk about climate change, resilience, and others. And when we look at the social protection systems, even the informal ones like the local saving groups, the food support and all that, humanitarian support, it became very, very important. It's from the local savings, the safety nets, that communities were able to cope because they could not go to work, they're under lockdown. Most of the communities are in formal employment where if they don't work, then they don't access food and others. But it's through those social protection systems, both formal and informal, that people were able to pull through. So governance becomes very important for resilience, right from community up to global level. That really becomes important. And we also saw that governments that were more organized, that had invested in their health systems, that had invested in skills, were able to cope than those that were not able to do that. And we saw issues of inequality also coming up. People in either bad settlements or those without health facilities and whatever, were more vulnerable to, they could not cope with the social distancing and stuff. So the issue of rights, dignity, and well-being becomes very important amidst all risks and shocks, the multidimensional, whether it's climate or health or whatever. And the narrative of social protection becomes interesting because if it's done right, the targeting for social protection really looks at those households and members of community that are really below the poverty line, are not able to cope and all. So it could be one of the mechanisms that could really support building the well-being of such communities. And if it's well designed and interlinked with the climate change adaptation, it can also address the causes of risk and vulnerability and use shocks to change the system and try to access funding across scale and address an equal power imbalance. But then also the issues of inclusion and the issues of inequality became very pronounced. We saw cases of gender-based violence coming up. We saw cases of high numbers of women working in formal employment, not accessing income, and their livelihoods getting harder. So the issue of addressing power and enhancing people's capability, the social exclusion and discrimination across scale becomes important. And such large-scale multi-sectoral programs like social protection and the human rights approach to development could address some of those things. But the other key challenge that we need to look at is the digitalization of the economy that we are moving into. Everything now is functioning online. And then we have the digital divide. We have geographical locations. We have individuals who are not able to access the services that we are able to. Things are difficult. We are doing research online, and sometimes we are not even aware of these things. I remember we're interviewing an organization in the global south, and their cameras are not on. And somebody says, "Can we see your faces for a minute?" And they told us that they spend £10 per hour if they engage in these meetings. And because we have the luxury of having internet and everything, so we call them and engage them. Sometimes we've not even refunded their costs, and then we expect them to engage with us. So I think we need to think more about access, or else we are going to exclude very many people in the process. So I would conclude by saying that we really need to think deep about this, look at evolving processes, modified practices and standards, and look at social norms based on the emerging evidence, so that the processes are able to be more sustainable and more inclusive, and incorporating everybody across society. Thank you, Angela.
Thanks, Tracy. You've raised a lot of really important issues there and things that we can learn from this pandemic. I think, yeah, that issue of who is excluded through all of this digital engagement, I think is such an essential one for us to keep in mind going forward. So thanks for bringing that out. I'd like to hear now from Gina on lessons we're learning from the pandemic around social protection and human rights to build resilience.
Thanks, Angie. So I think some really great points there. And I guess I just want to add a few things to that. So one is that I think I'm living in South Africa, and there's been an attempt by the government to support social protection. And I think when you look carefully at what social protection really is, you see how far it's falling short. So social protection is really about supporting well-being and the negative impacts of poverty and reducing poverty. But if you're just giving a grant, that's not necessarily doing that. And I think for me, the chasms in society have been so exposed during this pandemic. And I hope that governments learn the lesson that you don't want to just do enough to reduce poverty, but actually by bringing the poor along, by bringing in the voices of these different groups, you're going to start addressing things in a much more holistic way. We have to address injustices better. And I mean, I'm living in South Africa where there are so many injustices. And how do we have those conversations rather than pushing it aside and saying it's an economic issue? And so I think we've learned that, but we've also learned, and it comes back to some of the resilience lovely kind of anecdotes where I've worked with people in sort of social justice, social movements, and it's incredible to see some of the work that's been done at the community level, how people have come together with so little to support the people around them. And so for me, it's like, how do we build these things that have really emerged, that are these sort of shining lights that have come out of this? Yes, there's so much challenging stuff, but to build on that bottom up energy where there are connections, there's an understanding of what it means to kind of be human and support people who don't have when you do have. So I think there's a lot of things that I want to hold on to from this pandemic. And it's not the things that are really overwhelming. It's some of the things that are really beautiful.
Thanks, Gina. I appreciate that bit of positivity. It's always nice to remember that you know, there are some good positive things that we can take forward from this experience. I'm going to go back to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on resilience and what we've learned from the pandemic in terms of building resilience of communities, ecosystems, and societies.
Thank you so much for the platform. And thank you so much for the platform. And what I would want to add on is, this pandemic, it has sort of like exposed us, and we have identified the gaps and the loopholes that are there. And there is need for us to strengthen our institutional arrangement. By institutional arrangement, I'm talking about all departments, from the health sector to the environmental sector. It could be education sector. They need to be strengthened, and we also need to also take a look at good financial mechanisms, how we can create resiliency. Because if we are talking about resiliency, we don't want a situation where people are breaking, but it will be good where people bend than breaking, bouncing back and building back better. So by so doing, it will be so important for us to improve our social safety nets, so that as we are working on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and strengthening our institutions, it is also important that people, they get the basic needs that they need. It could be health, it could be good food, it could be good air to breathe. Because in as much as we are affected by the pandemic, it's not only health issues that came up, but we also realized that most of the sectors were actually affected by the pandemic. There was a disruption in transportation of goods from one place to another. It could be food transportation. It really affected a lot of people. So we need to tap into that, look into that, and make sure that we have good financial mechanisms, and people do not have problems to access that finance in times of a pandemic, so as to create and improve community resilience as we are reducing our greenhouse gas emissions.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. And again, I think it's really important to keep our eye on some of these practical issues that you're raising, and how important they are to sort of this broader question of resilience. So thanks for that. And I'm glad we've been able to get you connected so we can hear from you today. That's great. So my next question is around examples where gender equality, human rights, the rights of Indigenous peoples, and social inclusion are helping to build better and more effective communities and climate solutions. And John, I would like to hear from you on this. And if I can ask Jandira to mute yourself, please. Thanks.
Hello. Can you hear me? Hello,
Yes.
Angie, can you hear me?
Yes, all good.
Okay. Looking at examples concerning places where gender equality and human rights are helping to build effective communities and climate solutions, I will want to give example of our country, Nigeria, where the coming together of women's rights organization and other groups have seen the development of gender and climate change action plan for the country. Looking at the gender issues and human rights issues involved in the implementation of climate change action, the groups in the country decided that the country should build on the UNFCCC's gender action plan, and also have a national gender action plan which will guide the implementation of climate change programs and projects, and the integration of climate and gender issues in different programs, policies, and activities of government ministries and private organizations. So Women Environmental Program, that's my organization, led that advocacy in collaboration with other women's rights organizations and other civil society organizations, and the Department of Climate Change of the Federal Ministry of Environment. And together with support from both ends under their Gaga program, we started consulting different women groups and other stakeholders across the different geopolitical zones of Nigeria to put together an action plan, a document that will ensure gender issues, human rights issues are included in climate and other plans. So we went around and got input from different groups on what should be in that plan. And the plan was put together. And this year, last month, the Federal Executive Council of Nigeria approved that document as an official document which will guide implementation of climate change actions and other actions in the country. So that's one good example where gender equality and human rights issues have influenced a climate policy which will later translate into actions as is being planned, that there will be a framework that will guide the implementation of that plan in the country soon. So that's one good example of to show that gender equality and human rights issues have influenced and have actually put together gender responsive climate policies, and has taken into consideration the different needs of the different groups in the country in the implementation of climate actions.
Thanks, John. I think that's a great example, and it highlights for me two really important issues. One is around the process, going through the process of engaging all of the different stakeholders, but then also the formal adoption of the plan by the government. I think those are two really important pieces in terms of moving these types of issues forward. So thanks for sharing that. Elizabeth, do you have examples where gender equality, human rights, the rights of Indigenous peoples, and social inclusion are helping to build better and more effective communities and climate solutions?
Yes, thank you so much, Angie, for that. Just like John was saying, here in Zimbabwe, we just validated, I think a few weeks back, the Gender Action Plan, because as we are trying to improve our resilience, it is also important for us to consider the fact that we are also reducing inequalities that are there. And we have also identified that, the indigenous people, those are the custodians of the environment. And we are not only using a top-down approach, but we are also using a bottom-up approach. As we are reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, the indigenous community are protecting our forests, they are protecting our biodiversity through the use of the non-timber forest products, where they have seen that in as much as they are protecting the forest, they've realized that they can actually get to ensure that there's some food security that is happening. It could be through, accessing herbs, honey production through the forest, because you cannot cut down a forest. If you cut down a forest, it means that you don't have access to the honey and access to other livelihoods that come within. So these are the people that we have managed to put on the table so that we can discuss as we are trying to bridge in the policy gap, but also when it comes to improving the resilience of the community through maybe certain adaptation measures that we are putting. Those people, they are not left behind. And also we are not violating their human rights as we are trying to introduce these new policies as well, because these policies, they are interlinked. We have the Gender Action Plan of the Paris Agreement, but it also has to coordinate with our climate policy, with our climate strategies as well. So these are some of the examples that I can actually give you how the indigenous people have managed to protect and conserve our forests in a way also benefiting from those forests. Because when in the event of a disaster or in the event of maybe severe droughts, you see that this sector, the honey production sector, is not really affected. So these people, they can still rely on their forests for certain goods, services, and products. So this is what I have to share from my end.
Thanks so much. And I think you've highlighted some really important issues there around sort of ensuring resilient livelihoods over the longer term, taking into account that, communities are facing increasing risks, and also the importance of, connecting and aligning different policies on gender, on climate, on all of these interlinked issues, and that really, those connections really need to be made also at the policy level. So thanks very much for that. I'd like to hear from Olga on what are some practical steps that you think we should take to ensure that we're on a departure pathway from the current development pathway, assuming that you agree that the current pathway is flawed. Olga?
So, thank you, Angie. So I also was, if you don't mind, I would also like to answer the previous question, because I'm working with rural communities. And it is also very close to me, this issue that women, rural women, so that they are comprised 60% of the Kyrgyz population, and they are most vulnerable group. And during pandemic, so proved that women became even more vulnerable, taking into account that they are affected by climate change and by the effects of pandemic. So in this regard, we need to also to take into consideration the systemic issues when thinking about further steps. So like for Kyrgyzstan, the main systemic barrier, so to say, is patriarchy, where patriarchal society, especially in rural areas. And for us, it is like a burning issue of gender-based violence in rural communities, and the lack of participation of women in the decision-making, policy-making at all the levels. And we could see that when women manage to participate in the local decision-making, she really able to bring changes into the developmental policy of the rural communities. So it is really vital. And so in terms of the further steps, I think that we need to build this strategy on the capacity building, on increasing awareness on the climate change issues, and as well like increase capacities and on the digital technologies as for during this pandemic. So it was a great issue. It was a great felt inequality in rural areas, that access to digital technologies and all of these technological gadgets, computers, mobile phones. So deprive women in access to information, to resources, and the women with the fact that there is existing problem of access to markets and to resources, to productive resources, to land. It was during before pandemic, but with the pandemic, these problems became even more sharp. So in this regard, we need to have our political changes. So if we take the legislative base, for example, in Kyrgyzstan, so we have good laws from one side, but from another side, there is like a gap in implementation. So there is no like concrete mechanisms for implementation of laws that ensure gender equality and struggle with gender-based violence. And there is no financial covering. As for example, previously we had the gender action plan, for the 4 years period, and it's just finished this year. And more than 90% there were no finance covering for the gender action plan, for this gender action plan. And of course, this that is at the national level, and at the local level, we also could see this gap in the communication as it was mentioned by the participants, or lack of intersectionality, lack of multi-sector partnership, and especially the role of local self-governance structures was very low, but in fact it should be high in terms of development of the resilience of the rural communities. We need to strengthen this role of local governments, and so to say. And then another issue of technologies. So like they were mentioned about renewable energies, and we have very good examples when women, they first try this renewable solar energy in their rural communities, trying to bring this technology so that to improve their quality of life, like creating of solar heating or solar fruit and vegetable dryers. So with just these simple technologies, affordable technologies, they really can change their lives, and they can be a model of for transformative change agents, as we call them. So
Great.
And there is a really great power in women, and but like our like most awful devil or evil is this patriarchy, and the cause which causes gender-based violence and deprive women of all human rights, if we say. And so we need this like more deep and structural approach, and at the same time a more holistic approach to create more sustainable livelihoods for rural women and for their families. And
Thank you, Olga.
Stories of how women manage to
Great, and I'm very sorry to cut you off. It's just we're really running out of time. But thank you so much for sharing those important issues. And I think you've brought up a lot of key elements of this whole resilience building challenge around empowering local actors, around addressing the patriarchy, around sort of dealing with some of these deep structural issues. So thank you so much for that. I'm just going to give a heads up to the panel that I am going to give each of you a last word, but you will literally have one sentence. So while I ask Dominika this last question, I'd like you to think about one sentence that you would like the participants to take away on gender responsive and socially equitable resilience. And I'm going to be very strict about that one sentence because we do need to move on to the next part of the event. So Dominika, what are some practical steps that you think we can take to get on a departure pathway from current development pathways, if you agree with the assumption that the current pathway is flawed?
I think what is important is an integrated, multi-sectoral approach. We need to move away from a silo approach to dealing with some of these issues. So let's take an integrated and multi-sectoral and inclusive approach to dealing with the issues.
Great, thank you for being so brief. Do you want to give us your one sentence takeaway? I can come back to you. John, what is your one sentence takeaway that you would like to leave the participants with?
Yeah, my one sentence takeaway is that climate change mitigation is about the people. And if it is about the people, it has to be inclusive. That means it has to be gender responsive. And vulnerable people have to have their resilience built, and that is the only way we will achieve the net zero carbon emission by 2050.
Thank you. Tracy, what's your one sentence takeaway?
My takeaway would that we need downward accountability and shared risks, and also move away from short-term interventions that look at the symptoms of risk and address unequal power and in a more gender responsive way.
Thank you. Dominica, do you want to give us one more sentence? I'll come back to you, Dominica. Olga, do you have one sentence you'd like the participants to take away?
Yes, I would like to stress once again that we need ensuring women's active and equal participation, representation, and leadership at all levels. We need to remove discrimination from legal frameworks, and we need to promote change in social norms. Sorry.
You said and, it's okay. Thank you. Gina, what's your one sentence takeaway?
Thanks. So I really support what everybody has said. And to add to that is it's not going to happen without a fight. We're going to have to work really hard. The status quo is really dominant. And so we've got to stand up for those of us who, those people and all of us who want to change. Yeah, let's go.
Let's go. Thanks. Elizabeth, one sentence takeaway. Oh, we may have lost Elizabeth again. Dominica, I wanted to give you one more chance because I feel like I cut you off there on your last response.
Okay, thank you very much. I also wanted to say, in our interventions, let's not take women for granted. They've got the agency from their experience over the years in dealing with issues at various levels. So they've got the agency that we need to emphasize. So let's tap into women's agency. It can also help a lot, as well as indigenous knowledge systems. That's very important for resilience.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to see if Elizabeth can get sound. I'll give it one last try. No, I'm afraid we've lost her. So with that, I'm going to close the panel discussion. And honestly, we could have gone on for the full 2 hours. You were all fantastic. So thank you so much for sharing these really important insights. And we are going to continue the discussion in breakout rooms. But first, we have a poll for you. So if I could ask Malio to bring up the poll. So this is going to be a Zoom poll. We've got 3 questions. The first is, what are key barriers to putting gender equality and social inclusion at the center of climate resilience efforts? And you've got a few options here. We've got lack of data, information, evidence, business as usual approach to climate action, siloed approaches to climate change versus social justice or biodiversity and ecosystem management, unequal representation of people and communities in decision-making spaces and leadership, a sense that it's not worth it or it's not a good investment. So it's looking like the front runner is unequal representation of people and communities in leadership and decision-making spaces. And I'm going to end it there. Malio, can we end it so we can see the result? Yeah, so unequal representation followed by siloed approaches. And I think we heard a lot about that in the discussions. So let's go to the next question. Next question is, in what sectors are the greatest opportunity to implement gender and socially just resilience measures? And you've got options of agriculture, transport, infrastructure, energy, water, health, forestry, fisheries, and aquaculture, social development, all of the above. So I'll give it a minute for people to chime in. So it looks like there's a strong preference for agriculture as having the greatest opportunities. Can we stop the poll? Great. So yes, agriculture way out in front, followed by water, all of the above, social development. And we have one more question for you. Is the concept of net zero one that supports your idea of resilience? We've got options of yes, no, or maybe, but I have some concerns. It looks like it's moving between no and maybe. Maybe, but I have concerns. Great, so thanks very much. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move into our breakout groups. So it may take a minute to get there, so please be patient. And in the breakout groups, we'll be discussing two questions. The first is, what are the key barriers to putting gender equality and social inclusion at the center of climate resilience efforts? And secondly, what changes are needed to realize the transformation towards gender responsive and socially inclusive resilience? So we'll have around 20 minutes for the discussions. It may take a couple of minutes to get into the rooms, and then you'll be automatically moved back to the plenary at the end of the discussions. So
and if anyone ends up in a room that is English, but they prefer French, please just type into the chat or come back into the main room and I'll move you over to the French breakout room. All right, everybody, I'm gonna send you off into the Zoomverse.
Thanks, Malio.
Hi, welcome everybody. We take just 1 second to let others join our breakout group.
Hi.
Hello.
Great, maybe that's it. It might be that some people also dropped out now after the panel discussion. So welcome to our breakout group. My name is Pat Boland. I'm the coordinator of the Women and Gender constituency and will support the facilitation of our group discussion today. And as we are not that many people, I think it would be great before we go into the questions to just have a quick introductory round. So feel free to also start your video if your bandwidth allows, and unmute yourself for your welcoming. And I will just call on the names so that you can introduce yourself. So the first one I see would be Marla. Maybe you can introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Marla Borgener. I'm based in Switzerland. I'm an entrepreneur, social entrepreneur, founder of Gringo Web. But currently I'm doing a doctoral research and I'm looking at how and why should gender equity and climate action be integrated together within organizations? how they should be paired up, you know, like in one department. And I'm looking for case studies. So if you know anything, I'm open. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Maybe that can be taken up by somebody else already. Fiona, maybe you could introduce yourself next.
Yes, hello, I'm Fiona Marker. I'm currently working at the NGO German Watch. I'm based in Germany, and I am generally working on climate policy. I form part of the board of German Watch, but as you can see, I'm quite young, so I'm really here to learn about gender-specific responses, and yeah.
Thanks so much. Next one is Katja.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katja Pellini. I'm calling from Finland, and I'm a climate resilience specialist in Plan International Finland. So I'm also now looking at ideas on integrating actually better these issues in a framework of sexual reproductive health program, where we have a climate resilience component.
Thanks so much. And Karen, could you go next?
Yes, sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Karen Shippey. I work for the Western Cape government. So we're a subnational government in South Africa. And I am both the Chief Director, Environmental Sustainability. So climate change falls within my team, as does biodiversity, coastal management, sustainability. I'm also our department's gender focal point. So it is, even though it's not in my training, it's a journey that I started about 3 years ago to actually institutionalize what is already an extensive set of policy requirements within the South African government. But it hasn't, in our last 20 odd years of democracy, it really hasn't actually been properly institutionalized. So we're trying to do it within our department.
Great, thank you so much. So I think we are already diving into the barriers that people can experience in their own organization or also in policies. I will just paste the questions again in the chat box. And is there anybody who would be willing or happy to introduce or quickly summarize our discussion later on when we get back to the big group? If no one wants to volunteer, I will certainly also be happy to do that. If you feel like you can still volunteer at the end. Mala, would you like to or rather not? I don't want to put you on the spot. Let's dive into the discussion first and then see. Unfortunately, we have lost Alpha, who would be from Tunisia. So I think we are representing rather a different, we don't have any representation from Africa, unfortunately, except I have missed, you are, oh, I'm sorry, Karen. Good. So I have missed that because I was in parallel already organizing with other breakout groups. So maybe we can dive into the first question on what barriers you're seeing for putting gender equality and social inclusion at the center of climate resilience efforts. Is there anybody who would like to break the ice? I think we have actually heard quite many already today. But please go ahead with referring to your own experiences.
I'm happy to kick off if you're willing, Madam Chair.
That's great. Thanks so much, Karen.
Okay, so I think, ours are not the particularly astounding ones in terms of the barriers. One of the most fundamental things is that our policies all say the right things. Our laws say the right things, but when it comes to actually budget allocation, it definitely hasn't followed suit. So we have spectacular policies. We really have world-leading constitution and everything else that actually from its beginnings have included gender equality as well as all other forms of equality. But actually institutionalizing it in a country that was so divided racially as well as sexually as well as economic class has been another story completely. So we're finding that the discussion is very much quite a shattered one of just transition for race before gender and all sorts of other things. So there's a lot around the socioeconomic condition and whether or not gender should be the upfront consideration. Certainly people who, we've got these lovely terms in South Africa, previously disadvantaged individuals, PDIs, and historically disadvantaged individuals. And these things are actually defined differently. So women are categorized as historically disadvantaged, but they are not included under previously disadvantaged, where you actually have Black people and Chinese people, basically people who are deemed to be the ones who were separated by apartheid, and for whom development was very, very different in our country 25 years ago. So for us, it has been a very complicated story. And I think, interestingly enough, my own personal journey into the gender literature to try and see how we're going to internalize it within environmental management and development planning, where our department sits, is that we have a really important conversation to have across women that may actually be able to stitch together some of the other separation and hurt that we see in our society. Because it's interesting, you get a group of women together and it almost doesn't matter what culture they come from or even what language they speak. They will instantly start bonding over commonalities. And that's something you don't always find in our society. So it's quite a strong discussion point at the moment, but we are finding that actually getting resources for those conversations and for taking forward that particular institutionalization is almost impossible. Especially now after COVID, we're looking at a deepening recession. So we have a legal mandate that we have to fulfill to start with, and that revolves around our environmental regulations and laws, as well as our planning laws. So gender is seen as something on the back burner, but I think what we're starting to do is have that conversation, certainly amongst our own professionals, about why that shouldn't be the case, and how we need to actually ask ourselves that question of who benefits and who loses every single time we make a decision. And it's been a really progressive engagement with our staff. We've gone through training. Almost 75% of our teams are trained now and can actually do their own gender assessments. So we're starting to get this very deep sense of internal realization so that we can start bringing it through into our professional work. But budget is non-existent.
Thanks so much for so many important points, actually underlining intersectionality, importance of intersectionality and intersectional view, as much as really emphasizing that we need to have the budget to also implement the policies and laws that might even exist. Would anybody like to add something on that?
I just want to say, I think we need to run for office. We're not going to get the money in the budget for the women unless we're in office. So the more we can encourage us to run for office, the more we can bring that not only into the discourse with each other, but into the discourse where we'll get budget.
Thanks, Deborah. And I just realized that I might have missed a couple of participants. So if you want to speak, and you couldn't introduce yourself already, just introduce yourself quickly. I was not meaning to ignore anybody in the group. I'm really sorry.
It's okay. I actually came in late because it's very early for me in the day. But anyway, yeah, I'm Debbie Rowe, and I'm a professor of renewable energy technology and sustainable development for 40 years. And I'm running an international campaign with youth to get trade associations and multinational corporations to step up on lobbying for climate instead of just having internal sustainability initiatives. And I run the U.S. Partnership for Education for Sustainable Development and working on a global guidance document on greening the workforce. But I have both a mother who's passed and 2 daughters who keep me on the gender issue all the time. And I am very grateful to them for that.
Thank you, Deborah. Fiona, you basically unmuted yourself same time as Karen. Did you want to add something, or were you just involved in the discussion?
I was actually quite fascinated by what Karen said, because it's super interesting to hear it from a government perspective. As I'm working at an NGO and I'm working in Germany, it's quite a different story that I have to tell. So I cannot really talk about the government perspective, but I feel entirely different, because in Germany there is no real consciousness probably is the better word for intersectionality. So we've got laws that state that women are equal to men, and we've got laws that state that no one should be disadvantaged or should be discriminated against, but we don't have the implementation of that. We don't really see that, and we don't really have this consciousness of we have to put it first, because what I hear is always we've always got the right terminology. So yes, we have to be intersectional, and we have to put women at the center of climate action and so on, but you never really have something behind these words. And as an NGO, we try to change that, but it's not really that I could say there's something I could really talk about. I can only talk about what's not really there. But I'm not sure whether this is just my perspective or whether this is like really the thing. I would probably talk entirely different if I worked in the ministry for whatever.
Thanks so much. And I think it's definitely not a single experience that the acknowledgement and awareness of intersectional discrimination is missing in many countries, and is therefore an existing and continuously existing barrier for sure. I do think actually that we are not having too much time in our discussion, so maybe if you want to speak on barriers still, you could also add some ideas on what has to be changed in order to have and to what needs to be realized to transform towards a more gender responsive and socially inclusive resilience, which is actually our second question. If you would like to speak, just unmute yourself and go ahead. I see Katja and Kazosi to have unmuted yourself. So maybe just first handing to Katja, and then please go next. And we have 3 to 4 minutes left. So I'm really sorry, but I would like to ask you to be very brief when you speak.
Thank you. Maybe I'd like to start from what Karen already said about creating that space of listening. So having the opportunity to come together in a space where you can talk about these issues. And I guess the background for me is I find myself in a very interesting position now, because I come from the science-based resilience background myself, and now I'm thrown into a program which actually is by design already gender transformative, and it is actually a program where these issues have been thought through. So now I find myself in a position where the framework is there, but resilience is missing. So I guess the main lesson that I'm starting to understand through this couple of months that I've involved in this program is to be able to listen the lived experience, because that's where it is in the communities. People are experiencing climate change, and that's a very big issue for them. So now we who are supporting the program have to listen them and have to listen how to best integrate and create that space for listening.
Sorry.
Great, thanks so much. Mala, we have about 1 minute left before we are kicked off, so I hope you can briefly contribute. Thanks so much.
Yes, as an entrepreneur, of course, when you're on the ground trying to do something, budget is an issue. When you're at the higher level, I was part of Co-op 24, Co-op 20. Women behave like men. I think one barrier is that women are not aware that we're missing data on what we're doing. Women themselves don't realize the lack of data we have on what's actually happening, and that when we say leave no one behind, we're not talking about developing countries here. We're talking about women who are being left behind, and they need to address this, providing more data, or doing more research, or making it visible.
I agree. I agree with that. I think it's important, and put out the reports on it.
Thanks so much.
All right. I think most people are back in the plenary room now. So what we're going to do is just have a quick round of report back so that we can hear what was discussed in the other groups. And apologies to the speaker in my group who just got cut off a bit abruptly. So let's start with Anne. Can you give us just a very quick top points that came out of the discussion in your group?
Sure. Hi, everybody. And we were only 2 people in my group. So we had someone representing a expertise institution, a training institution on water and climate from France, and then a person from the Ministry of Sustainable Development of France. But she was not in, she had just come in the ministry. So our discussions were very much focused on the first question. We didn't have much time to address the second one, but one very interesting point was the need for capacity building of public institutions that deal with the implementation of national climate plans. And the fact that people still work very much in silos, and that the interconnection between gender or social issues and climate change is really not well understood, and that prevents these agencies or ministries or institutions that are responsible for implementing climate action do not interconnect these two domains. And that prevents from climate action to be conducted in a way that makes it really resilient. So that would be my most important message. I've taken note. For the rest, I don't want to monopolize the floor now, so I'll stop here.
Thank you, Anne. I appreciate you being concise. Great. Can we hear from Daniel? What were the top points discussed in your group?
Sure. Thanks, Angie. And we had 11 members in our team, so we'll borrow one next. We'll give you one next time. But we had a really nice conversation. The focus was mostly on the first one, on identifying the key barriers and the challenges, and on those, I want to highlight a few points around. One of them was around believing. The need for different stakeholders, different people in society, government, to believe in gender equality as an outcome, as an objective that is necessary to pursue. And even beyond that, understanding what it means and how it's done. So that even first step seemed like a very important point that we haven't got there, and let's not assume that we're always there and it's just a matter of acting, but it's actually even the understanding part, the making the case for it, unfortunately, kind of in some, cases needs to be still made. Issue of colonization also, how colonization and the principles that have come with that have shaped and continue to shape actually the way that the responses are built, the way that the social norms are continue to evolve, no? And interesting how one person talked about one colonizer has left, meaning the historical kind of global north colonizer, but another remains, and it's the kind of the system, of course, in many ways, or in many cases represented by men who are unwilling to accept and to digest and recognize the importance of gender equality. So there was that very kind of important way to convey the point. And also someone also mentioned increasing religious fundamentalism as a challenge to this problem, which I think is something for everyone to really think carefully about. When we moved on to the second question around, okay, what to do about it, what may be some of the solutions, let me list some of those that came up as important: more data, and in doing so also more research, and so building more evidence. But also there was a sense of, the way that research is being done has to change as well, so that it's more inclusive, that it's more open, so that the research questions are already more open to understanding and addressing, and therefore trying to answer this problem of a still existing gender inequality. And also seeing what is the value add. Some people were also saying, okay, let's also try to sell it as this will give you value. If you pursue gender equality and social inclusion, you will also, from other perspectives that are, like economic, you will find wins. And two final ones: access to quality education, particularly in rural areas, very important. And finally, someone mentioned about the accountability of governments for actually, even if things are in policy, for doing the implementation. If it's in the policy but it's not implemented, then of course little has been gained. So that's a quick summary, or not so quick, of what we discussed, Angie.
Thanks, Daniel. Next, I'd like to ask Pat to give us a quick summary of what you heard in your group.
Thanks so much, Angie, and also thanks very much to my breakout group, because I was also unfortunately not able to properly close the group because we had a very lively discussion. We had a great and wide background of participants in the group, from governmental employees to science, business, and NGOs and civil society. So it was really interesting to hear about differences, but also commonalities. I think many of the points that were raised also in the other groups were mentioned, and I'm not striving to fully cover our discussions. So if anybody would like to add later on in the chat box or unmute yourself, I would very much welcome you to do so. But some barriers that were mentioned were definitely that even if legislation and the framework for gender equality and social justice exist, often budget is still lacking and is not allocated to these important areas. And this has become even more difficult during the pandemic. Unfortunately, we also lack important data still, and definitely also spaces to address and get the input from communities and people on the ground that are directly facing the inequalities and need to increase resilience. What needs to be changed is definitely a more intersectional view on discrimination and more awareness for intersectionality, more space, as said, to raise those important issues, and women leadership. And I hope I have covered most of the discussion by those points. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Pat. So in my group, we talked a little bit about the barriers, and issues that were raised were barriers around governance, in terms of the structures, and particularly the representation of women and other marginalized groups at different levels of governance throughout all levels, from sort of community-based structures up to national and international, and the need to ensure women's leadership at all of those levels. And I think we heard from a few participants, particularly from India and Bangladesh, about some of the challenges that are faced in terms of the violation of rights of Indigenous women and the lack of enforcement of legislation, including in relation to gender-based violence, and that this is really a massive barrier to resilience. In terms of what needs to change, I think, the flip side of those things, we need sort of governance systems that are representative of the populations that they are intended to serve. We need to ensure leadership of women and people who face discriminations at all levels. Rights, just, enabling people to realize their rights is really at the center of all of this. And we talked about as well the role that men have to play in this, that this change, systemic change, requires efforts by all people, and that we can really start as individuals to make changes within our sphere of influence as a starting point for engaging with the sort of larger transformations that are needed. And I think I will stop there. Thank you so much for participating actively in the breakout groups. We really appreciate having your inputs, and thanks to all the facilitators for taking care of that. And apologies to those who did get cut off, but we really appreciated your inputs. So what we would like to do next is to get your last thoughts. We have one more Mentimeter to try to capture your closing thoughts before we end the session today. And the question that we're looking at this time is, what key messages around gender and social justice do you hope will come out of the Race to Zero dialogues? So I'll just give you a minute to get back into Mentimeter. Just note that it's a different code this time. The code this time is 8678200. Just give you a moment to get in there. Action. That's a good start. Dedicated support for gender and social justice. Intersectionality, networking, strength, funds. I think this issue of resources has come out quite strongly, and especially in relation to sort of policy influence or policy implementation, that we can have policies and legislation on the books that really sort of advance these issues, but if they're not actually resourced and if they're not actually implemented, they don't go very far. Positive masculinity, structural change, social justice is key, respect, important principle, gender responsive governance, funding to women's groups, I'll just give it another minute or two. Local perspectives, decolonizing funding. So I think looking at this, I think we've managed to touch on some very sort of deep and important issues that need to be addressed when we're looking at resilience with a gender responsive and socially inclusive approach. And I think that this word cloud really captures the issues that we would like to see taken forward as, the global community moves into this Race for Resilience campaign. So I'd like to thank you very much for your inputs today. If David is here, I wondered if he would like to say a couple of words about the next event. David, are you there? And would you like to just say a couple of words? David Howlett?
Yeah, yes. Thanks, Angie. Yeah, I'll probably put something. Well, great news is tomorrow, 6 p.m. UK time. So I know that's very early or very late for some of you, so apologies for that, but the champions will be sharing about their plans for a Race for Resilience campaign, and this is where an opportunity to sort of embed empowering women into it comes. So please do join that. I'll post the links in a moment. And we've got a great set of speakers as well, and we've got Salim Hook from Bangladesh, Jan Rockstrom, and Emma Howard-Boyd, who's the chair of the UK Environment Agency, and we have a number of initiatives speaking. And then at the end, we have Julia Cordono from the COP25 presidency, Patrick Rakunin is the CEO of the Global Centre on Adaptation, and also really good, we have Anne-Marie Trevelyan, who was just appointed UK's International Ambassador on Adaptation Resilience. She was the former cabinet minister responsible for the Department of International Development before it was merged with the Foreign Office. So I'll make sure I get those into the chat box now, but please do join us. And any comments, please share them with me now through the chat box or by my email. Thank you. And a big thanks to all the organisers for all these. This is the third of the gender dialogues. They've all been excellent. And looking forward to working with many of you on this call as we try and build a much better, fairer, equitable society, as well as climate resilient. So thank you, everybody. Let me quickly drop that link in the chat box now, so you'll see my head go down to look at my my computer.
Thanks so much, David. And I think we're all really looking forward to seeing some of those key issues and messages that were presented in the word cloud taken forward in this Race to Resilience campaign. And we've really appreciated the opportunity to have these three conversations. I think they've been fascinating and have brought out really an incredible range of important challenges and issues, but also solutions and ways that we can move forward. So we're very happy to be concluding this excellent series of dialogues. So with that, I want to thank you all for being here and for staying with us through to the end. I think it's been a super interesting discussion. I'd like to thank again our panelists for sharing their really amazing insights. Also to the team behind the scenes, Malio and Cesar, for making this run smoothly, huge thanks. And to the facilitators, and particularly to the interpreters. It's a really tough job, so we really appreciate your efforts there. And I think just to close, if people are able to turn on your video and just give a wave, we'll just wave goodbye, and we hope to see you at the event tomorrow that David has just shared in the chat box. So. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
That's great. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.